Good morning and welcome to the Education Committee's hearing on the fiscal 2020 preliminary budget. This morning we will focus on the Department of Education's preliminary expense budget. We will be hearing from Chancellor Richard Carranza and DOE's Chief Financial Officer Lindsay Oates. After that, we will hear from DOE's Deputy Chancellor Karen Goldmark and School Construction Authority President and CEO Lorraine Grillo, who will testify on the department's capital budget. Finally, we will hear public testimony, which is scheduled to begin hopefully around 1:30 p.m. The Department of Education's fiscal 2020 preliminary budget totals $26.9 billion, excluding pension and debt service, which represents 29% of the city's total budget. Including pension and debt service, DOE's total fiscal 2020 budget is $33.9 billion, 37% of the city's total budget. While the majority of DOE's funding does support our district public schools, we must remain focused on ensuring education funding is reaching the classroom and having a positive impact on educational outcomes. Since becoming chair of the Education Committee, I have been relentlessly focused on increasing school budgets by raising the Fair Student Funding, or FSF, floor. FSF is a critical source of funding for New York City schools, supporting 2/3 of a school's budget on average. I appreciate the funding invested over the course of this administration to raise the FSF floor, which includes $125 million invested last year at the Council's urging. This brought the FSF floor to 90% and the average to 93%. But the goal is to get every school to 100%. In fiscal 2019, the FSF shortfall is $756 million. This brings me to my next point, state funding. The executive budget proposed by the governor would result in a $300 million cut to New York City schools. The so-called education equity formula in the executive budget is an alarming overreach. FSF already allocates funding to schools based on the instructional and academic needs of students, and the idea that the state knows how to allocate funding to schools better than the city does is outrageous. I was pleased to see both the Senate and Assembly reject this proposal, as well as include more funding for school aid and foundation aid in particular in their one-house budgets. The state still owes New York City schools $1.2 billion based on the Campaign for Fiscal Equity. This money would get all schools to 100% FSF and then some. The Council will continue to fight for this funding because our students deserve it. I deeply appreciate DOE's collaboration in advocating for the funding our schools are owed, and I hope that the enacted state budget includes a funding increase that will allow the city to raise the FSF floor again. DOE's preliminary budget includes a number of areas of concern, starting with the $104 million PEG target that OMB has given DOE. While the mayor has said his signature initiatives will not be considered for PEG cuts, I believe we should be taking a hard look at the entire DOE budget. This includes examining the many equity and excellence initiatives funded over the past 5 years to determine whether or not these investments are having their intended impact and if the funding is being used as efficiently as possible. While the Council supports much of the work of the Equity and Excellence Agenda, which includes programs like AP for All, Algebra for All, College Access, Single Shepherd, and Universal Literacy, that does not exempt these significant investments from oversight. As we recently saw with renewal schools, sometimes well-intentioned education interventions do not have the full impact we hope for. The Council has also identified a number of major holes in DOE's prelim budget, including spending on Carter cases and related staff, spending on pupil transportation contracts and the new GPS system for school buses, and spending on school facilities, particularly the contract with New York City School Support Services, or NYCSSS. I hope DOE can explain why the budget doesn't yet accurately reflect these costs and provide insight into planned spending in these areas. The most egregious hole in DOE's budget is the lack of supports for students in temporary housing. Since fiscal year 2017, the city has funded supports for students in shelter, but never baselined the funding. I fail to understand why the current program is not included in this budget. Current funding of $13.9 million, which includes $2 million in council discretionary funding, provides critical supports to students in temporary housing, including 69 Bridging the Gap social workers. The program has been widely supported and lauded, not only by the council and advocates, but by DOE officials themselves. I hope to hear answers about why this funding is not included in the fiscal 2020 budget today. More broadly, there is a need, and I would say an urgent need, for additional social emotional supports in schools. Our school system has more school safety agents, approximately 5,500, than guidance counselors, social workers, and school psychologists combined. We must support the whole student to ensure they can succeed academically. I believe funding social emotional support staff has a significant return on investment, and I look forward to discussing ways to increase the number of guidance counselors and social workers in schools. I personally know of schools that are choosing to invest their limited resources in guidance counselors and social workers, and as a result are seeing real improvement in their students' academic performance. Finally, in fiscal 2020, the early childhood care system will transition from Administration for Children's Services, known as ACS, to DOE. Both agencies have been preparing for this transition for almost 2 years, and we remain hopeful that this transfer will achieve its goals of streamlining services for providers and families. However, the Council still has concerns, and I am particularly disheartened that there is no plan to address pay parity. As long as a teacher with the exact same credentials in a CBO-provided early childhood education classroom is making less than they would in a DOE classroom, our entire early childhood education system is destabilized and at risk. Perhaps even more importantly, many of the staff working in CBO-provided early childhood classrooms are women of color, and the lack of pay parity reflects fundamental inequities in compensation that the city should not support. I'm concerned that we are investing $174 million in 3K in fiscal 2020 when we haven't adequately supported the foundation of the existing UPK system by providing pay parity. And some housekeeping. I'd like to remind council members that the Chancellor and CFO are here to testify on the expense budget. Please save your capital questions for Deputy Chancellor Goldmark and President Grillo. Council members will be limited to 3 minutes for their first round of questions and 2 minutes for the second round if necessary. Public testimony on the education budget will begin at approximately, again, we're hoping 1:30 p.m. And if you are here to testify, please fill out a witness slip with the Sergeant at Arms. And before I conclude, I would like to thank the committee staff, the outstanding committee staff, Caitlin O'Hagan, Chelsea Batemore, Doheny Sampura, Malcolm Butterhorn, Jan Atwell, and Clema Johnson. I'd like to thank also my staff, Anna Scaife, Vanessa Ogle, and Eric Feinberg. And I'd like to introduce my colleagues who have joined us this morning. So far, we have Councilmember Andy Cohen, who gets, I think, the gold star, shares it with Councilmember Debbie Rose, and more members will be joining us. Councilmember Margaret Chin is here as well. Thank you, Councilmember. And now I'd like to thank Chancellor Carranza and CFO Lindsay Oates for coming to testify before the committee today, and we'll hear the testimony after the council swears them in.
If you could both just raise your right hand. And do you affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in your testimony before this committee, and to respond honestly to council member questions? Thank you. If you could just hit the button.
Yes.
Yes.
So good morning, Chair Traeger and all the members of the Education Committee that are here today. Before I continue, I am always particularly excited when I see students availing themselves of their First Amendment rights to not only participate but to be present. And I understand we have a number of our students here from Urban Youth Collaborative, and I want to publicly recognize them and thank them for their presence here today. My name is Richard Carranza, and I have the privilege of serving as New York City Schools Chancellor. Joining me this morning is Lindsay Oates, Chief Financial Officer for the New York City Department of Education. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on Mayor Bill de Blasio's fiscal year 2020 preliminary budget as it relates to the Department of Education. As we embark on this year's budget, I would like to thank Speaker Johnson, Chair Traeger, and the City Council for your partnership, advocacy, and generous funding that includes over $41 million last year alone in centrally funded initiatives, as well as the millions allocated by individual council members to support our school communities. Through the council, we have been able to support additional social workers and guidance counselors, provide schools with LGBT curricular resources, and expand the reach of our restorative justice programs. Together, we have made great gains, and together we have a lot of work to do. The mayor's preliminary budget of $33.9 billion allows us to continue our progress. During my nearly 1 year, 11 months exactly, but who's counting? As Chancellor for New York City, equity has been at the heart of my mission for our students. Let me repeat that. Equity, not yesterday, not maybe in the future. Equity now has been at the heart of my mission for our students, our families, our educators, and our schools. My highest priority can actually be boiled down to 3 words. As I've mentioned, advance equity now. These 3 short words encapsulate the enormous and profound obligation that we have to disrupt the entrenched systems that throughout our history have kept underserved students from achieving their potential. We must address the opportunity gaps that face students of color. Only an equity approach can right these wrongs. That is why we are looking at every single policy through an equity lens and investing in an agenda that disrupts the status quo. This administration has cumulatively made $4 billion in new education investments in an equity and excellence for all agenda to improve outcomes for our students. And we're seeing historic results. Our schools are the strongest that they've ever been. We have the highest graduation rate on record at 75.9%, which is 76%, rising across our city and amongst every demographic group. We have our highest college enrollment rate at 59% and our lowest high school dropout rate on record at 7.5%. For the 3rd year in a row, city students have outperformed students across the state on English language arts exams, and our students are continuing to close the gap with the state on the math exam. More students than ever before are taking and passing advanced placement exams in 2018, and we continue to build upon this administration's historic investments in early childhood education with the expansion of 3K for all. One of the things I'm proudest of, however, cannot be captured purely in numbers. It is the beginning of a cultural transformation at the DOE around family and community empowerment. I believe with every fiber in my body that we cannot do things to communities or for communities. We must do things with communities. That is how we will get more of our children on a pathway to success. We have been turning this commitment into action since the moment I arrived almost exactly a year ago by bringing more family input into everything we do. Once I touched down in New York City, I began a citywide tour to hear what parents were thinking about the DOE's strengths, the challenges and opportunities, and the work that we need to do. This listening tour brought me to 62 schools and 45 town halls where thousands of students and teachers, principals, parents, advocates, and elected officials across all 5 boroughs enthusiastically shared their thoughts with me. I heard parent leaders ask for several specific changes and improvements, from better technology to faster deployment of air conditioning in schools, both of which we are delivering on. But above all, I heard them ask for a school system that's more streamlined and responsive to their questions. That is why I'm proud that I hired Hydra Mendoza, the DOE's first ever Deputy Chancellor for Community Empowerment, Partnerships, and Communications, to strengthen our efforts to build deeper connections to families and communities. Deputy Chancellor Mendoza has been instrumental in developing the mayor's and my 5-borough parent empowerment tour to hear firsthand from parent leaders about their priorities for our school system. This is also why I reshaped the DOE's organizational structure, creating new executive superintendent positions on the ground to give families clear lines of communication and to bring resources closer to schools and provide them with clear lines of accountability and support. Finally, no effort to empower school communities is complete without making real moves to empower students themselves. This is why we will soon be bringing on board our first ever student voice manager, who will spearhead efforts to strengthen our dialogue and collaboration with student leaders from across our city, and to harness their feedback to effectuate real change in the Department of Education. Now that the landscape more effectively includes family voices, we are focused on working together to advance equity now. I want to be clear about the expansive view we take of equity. We have renamed the Division of English Language Learners and Student Support to the Division of Multilingual Learners to reflect the value of the hundreds of home languages spoken by New York City public school students and the division's goal of ensuring all students master English while honoring and supporting their multilingualism. We are similarly working to change the culture around our students with disabilities. Special education is a service, it is not a program. And our Chief Academic Officer, Dr. Linda Chan, and our Executive Superintendents are leading this work as we expand special education services and hire staff. We've hired approximately 4,300 special education teachers and therapists under this administration. These, too, are efforts to advance equity for students who deserve the same access to an excellent education as their peers. The notion that every student in a zip code has access to an excellent education underpins our Equity and Excellence for All agenda, which I am pleased to report is in action throughout the city. For the first time this past fall, universal literacy programs were in all of our 32 districts. We have 437 reading coaches currently working to ensure all of our students are reading on grade level by the end of second grade. Last school year, through Computer Science for All, 134,000 students received computer science education, a 44% increase from previous school year. The number of students taking AP computer science exams in 2018 also rose to 5,190, more than a fourfold increase than 2016. We have also opened 47 new career and technical education programs in the last 3 school years alone. These programs equip our students with the skills necessary to seamlessly transition into college or the workforce. As a first-generation college graduate, I was thrilled to celebrate my first College Awareness Day as Chancellor. This school year, through the College Access for All, every middle school student will have the opportunity to visit a college campus. Likewise, every high school student will have the resources and support at their school to graduate with a plan for college and a career. College Access for All has also eliminated the CUNY college application fee for low-income students and made the SAT exam available free of charge during the school day for all high school juniors. Our third citywide SAT school day will be 1 week from today. These are just a couple of the highlights of the Equity and Excellence agenda. Every school in the city is experiencing an element of the expansive E&E agenda, and this includes schools that have taught us a great deal of valuable lessons from their participation in 4 years of the renewal program, like how important it is to support school leadership and teacher growth and family and community empowerment. I'm excited to move our system forward with a citywide equity-driven approach to supporting all schools in place of a binary approach, where either you got a renewal designation or not. Our approach is called Comprehensive School Support, CSS for short. And it's not a program or a designation. It's a strategy for identifying needs and delivering support to all schools using the DOE's new streamlined structure and implementing a new system of collecting real-time data. This kind of tailored support is the basis for our recently launched collaborative schools model known as the Bronx Plan, which is designed to address the specific needs and challenges of historically underserved schools across our city. The Bronx Plan builds off of the new 43-month contract with the United Federation of Teachers, UFT, encouraging educators to invest their talents and energies in 180 historically underserved schools with hard-to-staff pay differential for certain critical positions. The first cohort of 50 schools that agree to participate in the Bronx Plan include 32 schools in the Bronx, 11 in East New York and Brownsville, and 7 from the Rockaways. In addition to reforming the ways we support schools, we are finally acknowledging the elephant in the room, and that is segregation. I've lived and worked in communities throughout the nation, and I can tell you that in all of those places there is housing and school segregation. But a public, and I emphasize public, school system should represent the entire city that it serves. The work to address segregation and make schools more reflective of the diversity of our city is key to increasing academic achievement and opportunity. That is why we are taking a hard look at some of the enrollment practices from 3K through 12th grade. In fact, our recently released Birth to 5 Early Childhood RFP aims to make early childhood education classrooms more socio-economically and racially integrated by bringing together programs that have traditionally served low-income families with our 3K and pre-K programs that are universal for all families. After community-driven processes, I was pleased to approve plans put forward by Districts 3 and 15 to increase middle school diversity. Including those districts, 90 schools across the city now have a diversity and admissions plan in place. That's up from just 7 schools when diversity and admissions programs started 3 years ago. And we want to support communities throughout the city in developing locally driven diversity plans, which is why we launched a $2 million grant program to do just that. School districts have been submitting applications over the last month, and we have also released a plan to improve diversity at our specialized high schools and are continuing to review the initial report issued by the School Diversity Advisory Group. Our students deserve to learn with one another and to see themselves reflected in the books they read and the lessons they're taught. Our curriculum is uplifting a diverse range of voices. This includes the Passport to Social Studies curriculum, which has lesson plans about African, Latino, Asian, Middle Eastern, and Native heritage people, as well as gender, LGBTQ, and religious history. Other new curricula will recognize and purposefully include undocumented students, and we know there's much more work to do in this area. This culturally responsive approach will complement the work of the newly created Division of School Climate and Wellness, which honors and supports every child's experience in the classroom and school community by offering socio-emotional support and restorative practices. Deputy Chancellor LaShawn Robinson is spearheading this work as she leads the way in examining how to reduce racial disparities in school discipline. This division is investing $23 million to provide anti-bias and culturally responsive training for all school staff, $47 million annually to support schools with critical resources to strengthen their culture and climate, and $8 million annually to anti-bullying initiatives. These investments are essential to ensuring that our schools have high expectations for all students and are safe spaces for children and adults alike to share the truest version of themselves. So as we approach the 50th anniversary of Stonewall, we are continuing our work to support our LGBTQ students, families, and staff through events and trainings and other efforts to ensure that our school communities are gender inclusive. And yes, you can again count on me to march with our school communities in the Pride March this year. In order to continue our work to advance equity and meet the needs of our most vulnerable students, this administration has targeted $12 million in federal funds to programs for students in temporary housing, bringing this administration's total investment in students in temporary housing programs to $28 million. This additional investment includes 100 school-based STH community coordinators, an improved structure for overseeing STH resources, and expanded professional development to staff supporting students in temporary housing. The new $12 million investment builds on an existing $16 million investment that includes bridging the gap social workers, the after-school reading club at shelters, and the school proximity project. I am also grateful for the council leadership in allocating additional funding for social workers and guidance counselors. I know the School Construction Authority will testify on the capital plan this afternoon, but I want to say that we are excited by the unprecedented investments in our $17 billion capital plan and what they will bring, including a record $750 million for accessibility initiatives, as well as funding for 57,000 seats over the next 5 years. Importantly, we've coupled our capital plan's accessibility investments with a reform to our admissions policy that gives students with accessibility needs admission priority to fully accessible schools. We're continuing to put money directly towards fair student funding, including over $800 million throughout this administration to raise the FSF floor. When this administration started, the FSF floor was at 81%, and the average school had an FSF level of 87%. With this council's help, the FSF floor is now 90%, and the system-wide average is 93%, as Chair Traeger has mentioned. We must do more to ensure that every school has the resources its students need. However, we cannot meet this goal without state fulfilling the promise of the Campaign for Fiscal Equity. I am very supportive of Chairman Traeger's comments. In this fiscal year alone, the state has shortchanged our students to the tune of $1.2 billion. Instead of meeting its obligation to the CFE, the governor has a proposal that would essentially force the DOE to redirect existing funds. The proposal would mandate that 75% of our funding increase go to 22% of schools, leaving out nearly 1,300 schools. The remaining funding would not be enough to keep up with the cost for nearly 1,300 schools left out of the formula's focus, literally robbing from Peter to pay Paul. Under the leadership of this mayor and through the hard work of our talented educators, we have a great deal to be proud of, from free full-day high-quality pre-K for all, our ever-expanding 3K for all, to 70,000 seventh graders going on yearly college visits, to the highest graduation and college enrollment rates on record. We are hopeful that legislators at the state level will extend mayoral accountability to enable us to push harder and help our children go even farther. Because the history that we are writing together is one that doesn't accept the status quo. We are changing the system and advancing equity now. And yet, we all know we have more work to do to unleash our students' innate brilliance, unlock their creativity, and put them on a path to their dreams. We are grateful for the City Council's continued partnership and support in this necessary and hard work. I want to thank you for your time, and we will be happy to answer any questions that you may have at this time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chancellor. Just want to note that we've also been joined by Councilmember Cornegy, Councilmember Drum, and Councilmember Brennan. So, Mr. Chancellor, it's almost your one-year anniversary here with New York City Schools, and we thank you so much for being here today. My first question, actually, I think is just a reflection question. In your almost 1 year here on the job, what would you say are the areas of strength in the city school system and areas of weakness that we have to do much better on?
Thank you for that question. I would say that the areas of strength, I've lived now and worked in 5 states in 5 urban school systems, from the West Coast to the Midwest to the East Coast. I have never found in anywhere that I've lived and worked in my almost 30 years as an educator a more informed, passionate, and active community around its traditional public schools, from students to teachers to parents to advocacy groups. Very well informed, very articulate, passionate people that care about public schools. I would also say that, and this is by no means because of who I'm sitting with, but I would also say that I have never found elected officials who actually put their resources where their mouths are in terms of supporting public schools. I am consistently impressed as I go around and see schools and speak with principals and community organizations, the level of investment that city council people and assembly people and senators and borough presidents invest in their schools, and can tell me chapter and verse of how that investment is related to the school's academic plan. That is something you do not find across the country. I would say the other strength that we have in New York City is that we have a mayor under mayoral accountability that has a vision for education and uses the weight and the bully pulpit of the mayoralty and the leadership of the mayoralty to actually put programs in place that serve students in this community. I've mentioned a number of those programs, but there is nowhere else in America where the residents have free universal pre-K available to all of their students. In fact, it pains me to say there are places in America where children don't even have full-day kindergarten. Yet in New York City, we've added a whole grade level called pre-K, and we are adding an additional grade level we call 3K. That is unheard of and unprecedented. So I would say that also we have within the Department of Education a number of folks that are very committed, that have dedicated their life to serving the students in New York City. Again, I think that that is remarkable in a system that is so large. The challenges that we have in New York City are not unlike challenges I've seen elsewhere, and some are unique to New York City. I think one of the biggest challenges is just the size of our system. There is no one that compares to New York City in terms of the size of the system. We are the largest system in America, I would say in the world, in terms of a free public education. That creates its own opportunities, but its challenges as well. Messaging, implementation, et cetera. I would say one of the challenges that we have is that New York City, prior for at least the past 20 years, there's been a number of approaches that have been taken which have led to a very loosely coupled system where decentralization is seen as kind of the lifeblood of our system. And while I am not in any way, shape, or form against a decentralized approach, I think that there should be in a system. We are a system of schools. We are not schools that exist within a system. So it is important that we as a system believe in certain things and that we invest our resources, that we invest our time and our talent into achieving those values that we believe in as a school system. That is a challenge with a system that is so large. And then the third thing that I would say is while folks have said to me since I've arrived, we are the best funded state in America in terms of public education and that no one comes even close. I think you have to look at the challenges that come in living in an urban environment, the cost of living in a city like New York City. And when you then do the math on what that costs, we are not the highest funded education system in America. And the fact that the state of New York has yet to live up to its financial responsibility in terms of the campaign for fiscal equity has real consequences at the ground level for communities and principals that want to hire additional staff members, communities that want to hire or create extended learning opportunities, communities that want to establish fine arts programs in all of their particular schools. So I think that that really is a challenge that I am extremely excited about this council's voice, this chairman's voice, and quite frankly, our Assembly and Senate colleagues that have put forward proposals to rectify that wrong. We could spend the rest of the day on the good, and a little part of the day on some of the challenges, but in general, as I reflect on the 12 months that I've been here, I am extremely, extremely energized and optimistic about our future. But those are my initial thoughts about our strengths and some of the challenges.
Thank you, Mr. Chancellor. So we'll get right into budget questions. First question, which is an issue that is of deep importance to me in this committee and this council, certainly. Why isn't the $13.9 million invested in students in shelter supports, including 69 Bridging the Gap social workers, included in the fiscal 2020 budget?
So we are very supportive of those resources. We, as no one has to explain to the council, we are in the preliminary budget. So we are continuing those conversations with our colleagues in City Hall. And we have made it very clear that we think those resources are extremely important. I would also point to the fact that as we are really focusing on serving our most vulnerable student populations, and by any accounting, students that are in temporary housing would fit that definition, we are adding, in addition to the counselors, we mentioned the 100 community-based personnel that are supporting our students. We are also working with our existing counselors, not necessarily based in the shelters, but in schools, around how to identify, how to access support services for students in temporary housing. So in short, we are looking at how comprehensively we can wrap our arms around this particular group of students. And again, I want to reiterate that we also see the value in that investment and are continuing to work with our colleagues and advocate for the inclusion in the executive budget.
Right. I appreciate, Mr. Chancellor, your appreciation of the value of the program. And I think the CFO would agree with me that there are contractual challenges when there's uncertainty at this time of year about whether the funding will exist or not. And it took a while for the social workers to even get hired in the first place, which we'll get to in my deeper line of questioning. And it's really not fair to the students that are being served by these social workers and to the social workers themselves, whether or not they will have a position in our schools next year. So I want to flag this as a very significant priority for this council. I think for myself, on a personal level, we have so much more work to do in this area. And we understand that there are 100 schools with 50 or more students living in shelters and no bridging the gap social worker. This includes PS 288 in Coney Island in my district, which has 52 students living in shelters. Will you work with us to ensure that more of these schools get bridging the gap social workers through this year's budget process?
Noted, and we are supportive.
And we are supportive as well, Mr. Chancellor. In November, the DOE announced that the city will spend $12 million on new supports for homeless students, including 100 coordinators for schools with high percentages of students in temporary housing. Is this funding reflected in the budget, and where did DOE find these resources?
Thank you, Sheriff, for that question. That program is funded by Title IV dollars, so federal resources are funding that program. And it is in our, it's funded by federal dollars, yes.
And how did DOE decide to invest in coordinators rather than provide other supports?
So Chairman Traeger, I think we want to have a multifaceted approach, which includes not only coordinators, but counselors, social workers, et cetera. The real reason is that with coordinators, they can work 12 months, and we chose to invest in those positions so we would have a 12-month footprint working with the students in temporary housing, rather than investing first in the pedagogical staff, which is a 10-month position. So we chose which to go first so that we would have a continuity of services. It doesn't mean that we don't want to continue to add, but that's why we went with the coordinators first.
Right. Just to note, Mr. Chancellor, that in my understanding, in the briefing that I received, the family assistance coordinators, they're called, they themselves are not licensed social workers. This is an area of concern for us because they're the folks at the front end of the process interacting with families at the front end. We have learned historically that if folks who are engaging and informing our most vulnerable families about critical information, if they themselves don't know what questions to ask and what to do and how to follow up, it becomes a bigger problem in the long run. This is an area of significant weakness, and quite frankly, from a budgetary standpoint, I think there's a greater impact of having, let's say, 50 social workers than 100 coordinators who are not licensed and really trained and skilled in dealing with our most vulnerable student populations. I'd like to just kind of hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I note the concern. It's, again, a strategic decision. Do I want families and students in temporary housing receiving 10 months of service, or do I want 12 months of service? I will be very clear that I support social workers. I think the training is incredibly important. We are training those coordinators to, obviously they're not MSWs, but we're training those coordinators around what they should be asking. We have a protocol of what they are looking for. And then we are, I think, which is very strategic, making sure that they are connected to the right services that they can refer clients to. But again, it's not a perfect situation. In a perfect world, the funding exists to do both at the same time. I want to reiterate that we believe social workers are important. We believe counselors are important. And we look to be able to add that level of support very, very soon. But it was a very practical decision. Do we want 12 months of service, or do we want 10 months with a gap of 2 months? We didn't want to do that.
So, Mr. Chancellor, I appreciate your remarks that you value, and I believe that you do value social workers and guidance counselors. If that's the case, why did the city impose a freeze on hiring guidance counselors and social workers?
Well, I want to remind everyone that the freeze is reviewed on a yearly basis, and actually more than a yearly basis. But I also want to remind everyone that we have a body of accessed counselors and social workers through school closures, et cetera, that are fully qualified, are fully licensed to fill the need. And what we've been doing is actually matching social workers and counselors with appropriate schools to try to make those matches first. Now, in some cases where we haven't found the right fit, on a case-by-case basis, we've been allowing schools to hire. But again, we do have counselors and social workers that are available to be assigned in those positions, and that's why the freeze has extended to those particular positions. Again, we are reviewing what needs still exist out there, and that freeze may be lifted as well.
Mr. Chancellor, and for interest and clarity, is it your call to lift the freeze, or is this a call that the mayor and OMB has to make?
Yeah. This would be my call.
And so I am respectfully asking you, Mr. Chancellor, to lift the freeze and to make it easier for our schools to hire much-needed guidance counselors and social workers. I understand the complexity of the system. I fully understand. But I think you and I have exchanged some of the challenges schools face in even dealing with some of the folks who have been accessed in the ATR pool. I think schools just need greater flexibility. I think the current structure is just not working. And there are public schools in our system in the year 2019 that do not have one guidance counselor or one social worker, and that is unacceptable.
Yeah. So your concern is noted, sir, and we are working to make that happen. As I am briefed on those particular concerns, there is a conversation to be had. Is it that a school does not have a social worker or a guidance counselor because they don't have the budget for that? Or is it because they haven't found the right person for that? And then we are out actually looking at licensed credentialed people, and is there a way to match them with those services? So you are absolutely right that this is a complex issue, but I do share your concern and your focus on making sure schools are able to hire as quickly as possible within a responsible fiduciary environment where we are taking a look at every option that we have.
And just to note that even with schools that might have one guidance counselor or one social worker or maybe one school psychologist, many of these schools don't have them full-time. Mm-hmm. So they might have them for a few days a week. But I will tell you what they do have 5 days a week: school safety agents. Mm-hmm. We need to turn this ratio around, Mr. Chancellor. In fiscal year 2019, DOE found $273.7 million in savings through the citywide savings programs, including $137.7 million that was baselined. In fiscal year 2018, DOE found $166.4 million in savings, including $172.7 million that was baselined. DOE has already identified $133.6 million in savings across the November and prelim plans, including $95.6 million that is baselined. OMB has set a PEG target of $104 million for DOE. Can you describe how DOE will identify these savings?
So I'm going to ask our Chief Financial Officer to give some more detail on that. We are part of the city, and as the city grapples with what could be a tumultuous financial outlook, we understand our responsibilities as part of the city. That being said, in light of the fact that the needs of our students don't diminish over time, in fact, the needs of our students increase over time, I am grateful that the target could have been much larger. I am not obviously thrilled that we have any target, but we also understand that we're part of the larger city infrastructure and that all of us are tightening our belts. With that, we are trying to be very thoughtful about how we meet our target, and that's why I'm going to ask our Chief Financial Officer to talk a little more detail about what that looks like.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for the question. Under the Chancellor's leadership and my own, we are constantly looking for efficiencies in the department's budget, not just in a PEG climate, but all the time, because it's the right thing to do. We have, fiscal responsibility to our students to ensure that services are provided in the most efficient way possible. And so this is ongoing work, not just in a time now that we're asked for certain targets, but it's ongoing. We're continuing to look at opportunities internally, and we'll be working with our city partners in this work, and there's going to be more to come on the specifics at a later point.
This has been a theme at many of these budget hearings in the prelim, that the administration is not being clear and transparent with the council about these areas where the agencies are being asked to propose cuts to OMB, and respectfully, that's just not acceptable. We are a co-equal branch of government. We have to advocate just as well as you advocate. And how are we supposed to know what to advocate for if there's no transparency in terms of the budget process? I mean, clearly we have identified some areas that have been cut that we're going to fight like hell to get restored, like bridging the gap social workers. But this is a major area of concern and frustration for us in the council. And this is not how a budget process should work. Will school budgets be considered for PEG cuts?
So there are no sacred cows. No sacred cows. And you mentioned early that equity and excellence agenda items were not to be touched. We're actually looking at everything. So we're looking at every aspect of the DOE. We're looking for efficiencies. We're looking on return on investment. Obviously, when you look at school site budgets, that is the last area we would ever want to even look at for cuts. Everything is on the table, but some things are first, schools are last.
Well, all right, Mr. Chancellor, because that leads us to our next kind of line of questioning. The fiscal year 2020 spending on Algebra for All, AP for All, College Access, Single Shepherd, and Universal Literacy totals $207.2 million. How does DOE track the performance or return on investment of these equity and excellence programs?
So we have a tracking system. I think some of it is evident in terms of when you look at our math academic achievement as measured by just one particular metric. It's going up. Our college access rates are going up. Our graduation rates are going up. Our suspension rates are decreasing. So there are some generalized ways of taking the temperature as to whether they're being effective, but we also have a number of ways of tracking those particular initiatives. I'm going to ask our Chief Financial Officer to talk a little bit more detail about those.
Sure. So again, thank you for the question. We have teams internally, both the program offices that manage this work and other teams who are evaluating these programs in real time. They're looking at the outcomes. They're looking at the outcomes across demographic groups. Another thing just to remember is that these programs are still relatively new. Many of them are only phased in to all schools this year. So initial evaluations at this point are still initial, and we are continuing to review the impact as they are rolling out across the system.
So I appreciate that there is some sort of tracking going on the effectiveness of these programs. Is there a timeline by which DOE expects to see improved outcomes based on these programs?
I mean,
Go ahead.
so a timeline for outcomes, I mean, obviously every year we're looking at the metrics that the Chancellor mentioned, and we are, reevaluating and attempt to be dynamic to the feedback that we get in real time to make sure that if there's something that needs to be changed, it's changed.
And can you share any of those outcomes you have so far?
Many of them were in the Chancellor's testimony, but we can certainly get back to you with a lot more specifics on that topic.
Yeah, I mean, particularly, for example, has the number of students reading at grade level by second grade increased as a result of the program?
So we can get all the details on all of those programs that you've mentioned, and we'll get those to you in written form.
Yeah, I am deeply concerned about the area of literacy in our elementary school grades.
I am too.
And and that's one of the reasons why I'm a big supporter of UPK and the full promise of it. Of course, we need more funding to get parity across the board, because to identify those issues early on, to make sure that kids are reading and writing at level, because it's very hard later in the system, Mr. Chancellor, you would agree, to address these challenges. So I would like to get some data and feedback on that. The area of social emotional supports. There are currently less social workers, guidance counselors, and school psychologists combined than school safety agents. Does DOE believe additional social emotional support staff are needed in our public schools?
So, Chairman Traeger, I'm going to give a little more of an extended response, and I will tell you that one of the things that I should have included as one of the things in my first year that I think goes very well in the DOE has actually been the relationship that the DOE and the Chancellor, yours truly, has had with you as the Education Chair and this City Council. I think that has been an incredibly powerful conversation and action. But I'm going to push back a little bit on this notion that we constantly conflate school safety agents with counselors and social workers. It is a false narrative. Let me tell you why. Because I believe, as a lifelong educator, I truly believe as a lifelong educator that there are not enough counselors. There are not enough social workers. There are not enough trauma counselors in our public schools, especially in urban environments. There just aren't. Living in an urban environment is getting more complex. It's becoming more difficult. When you add into the mix all of those societal ills that happen in an urban environment, of which New York City is definitely one of those cities, it defies logic for anyone to ever say that we shouldn't have more counselors, we shouldn't have more social workers. And as I testified at the Assembly and at the Senate, it's just a matter of money. If we have more money, we're going to hire more of those positions. But the sad reality is that principals in this system, in a decentralized system, are given an allocation, and the allocation is based upon what funding is available. And then those principals are told, you make do with what you have in your allocation, and principals have to make the very difficult decision, do I hire another teacher to reduce class size, or do I use that funding to hire an additional counselor, or as you very, very astutely have noted, do I use that funding to hire one counselor? And I think that the real conversation that I appreciate that you are leading is, where is the funding, the formulaic funding that comes from the state to allow us to fund our schools so principals don't have to make those kinds of choices? That is what we should be, and I'm glad that we are pushing on. But the issue of school safety is not an issue. It is not an issue until it's an issue. And I'm sorry, I've worked, like I've said, across this country. And I think it's the wrong conversation to have about how many safety agents you have, because it's not an issue until, God forbid, something happens in one of our schools. And then folks are going to say, well, we should have had safety agents. Then they're going to say, we should have had this, we should have had that. As a chancellor, I am an educator. And I will always say, put that money in counselors, social workers, high-quality teachers, make sure you have programs and programmatic approaches. But I will not conflate that with making sure our schools are safe, that they are being protected, that we know who is entering our buildings, that we can monitor the exits of our buildings, where we can make sure that they are being safe and supported. And the one thing I'm going to ask in this conversation is that, while it's important to know how many school safety agents we have, and we can have a conversation about what they do, how they do it, when they do it, it's important to understand that safety in the 20th century, the 21st century, in America's public schools, in an urban environment, is something that has to exist. And I will continue to work with our partners in the New York Department, in the NYPD, to make sure that our school safety agents have the appropriate training. But I will also continue to lock arms and work very, very aggressively with this city council and this chairman in making sure we get additional funding so we can hire more of those counselors, more of those social workers, more of those trauma-informed counselors, psychologists. I think that's really important. But I'm going to continually ask that we don't conflate the two, because they are different. And I think the issue of not enough counselors is a real issue that we should take on in and of itself.
So, Mr. Chancellor, so I just want to share with you, in one school in particular, it actually happened in my district, what was considered an NYPD activity. A 7-year-old child did not have his assigned paraprofessional for a particular day. The DOE could not provide a sub-paraprofessional for that day. The child had a bad day. Police were called. School safety agents, NYPD, had to respond to a 7-year-old child having a bad day in a school that has inadequate supports. And so I fully appreciate the role and value that safety agents can play and should play in shaping school climate. I would hope you would agree with me that a 7-year-old having a bad day is not an NYPD matter.
Absolutely unacceptable. And that is an issue that goes to why was that treated in that way? Why was NYPD called? That is an issue of supervision, quite frankly. That is an issue of training, quite frankly. That's an issue of not having the appropriate resources. It's not an issue of how many safety agents versus how many counselors, is the point that I'm trying to make. And I absolutely agree with you, Chairman Traeger. That is unacceptable.
On the topic of NYPD, when will DOE and NYPD be releasing their updated MOU, which the department has been promising coming soon for years, actually?
I haven't been here for years, sir. I've only been here for 11 months, and I will tell you that in the 11 months that I've been here, because I have had conversations with hundreds, if not thousands, of students, communities, parents, advocacy groups, we have had a very robust negotiation and conversation with NYPD around this MOU. I was not satisfied with what I saw was developing, and we have had those conversations to get us to a place where I think we can all be very supportive of it. I will tell you that it is in its final stages, and I wish I could be more specific, but we are in the very final stages of that MOU.
And just to note, I definitely agree that this is just 1 year on the job. NYPD has, just to note, Mr. Chancellor, has not been responsive to even the mayor's signature. So in 2015, a law was passed, requiring that they provide us data on where metal detectors and scanners are in schools. They still have not given the council that information.
Wow.
What we pass are not recommendations, they're laws. And I think some folks in NYPD need a civics lesson on what a law is. And just as we flagged, because public safety had its hearing, they had mentioned that the DOE is in possession of this data of the MOU. And anything you could share, Mr. Chancellor, at this point about where it kind of stands at this moment?
So as I've mentioned, Chairman Traeger, there are a number of issues that we've really pushed each other on, and we've been very clear about what we believe in terms of student rights, what we believe schools should be, and more importantly, what they should not be. So we both are in a position now where we are almost at the signature stage. So I would say to you that I'll be very, very clear about the fact that it's time to sign the document, and there are things that we have both moved on. But again, we're holding the line on what schools should be and what should happen in schools, and we're ready to sign.
Because just to be clear and to give greater context to this issue, as Chalkbeat noted, which I want to give them a shout out, we're technically still under a Rudy Giuliani era school safety system, which is unacceptable. I want to remove all remnants of that system under Rudy Giuliani. That system has really had a disproportionate impact on students of color and the most vulnerable, marginalized students in our school system, in terms of suspensions, in terms of long-term suspensions, in terms of school arrests. What some folks in government would deem an emergency crisis could be a young child having a bad day because their supports were not in the school. And so we cannot, this is a school system. This is not an NYPD system. And I just, I think we need to make sure that the power pendulum swings back in terms of schools controlling schools. And again, understanding that agents have a role in shaping school climate, They cannot be dominating that climate. School officials should be controlling their schools. I just have a few more questions on FSF, and then I'll turn to my colleagues who have been very patient. And what portion of this year's FSF increase was used for staff?
Our CFO will answer.
Great.
Sure, thank you for that question. 95% of the increase was used to support teachers and guidance counselors, social workers.
Now, was that for new staff or just existing folks in their schools?
New staff.
You're saying 95%? Does the DOE track the titles of school-based staff that are hired using additional FSF resources? And do you have like a breakdown of the different titles?
Yes, we can provide that. But it's what I said, it's teachers, guidance counselors, social workers, and then some other titles, but we can provide the specifics.
So, and how many additional school-based staff were hired as a result of the FSF increase?
I don't have that information with me, but I'm happy to provide it to you afterwards.
I would be very happy to get that information because I think, we had a meeting about this issue, and I just want to kind of flag this again, that there are schools in our city that have an average teacher salary, an average building teacher salary that is higher than the citywide average teacher salary. And so, for example, there's a school in southern Brooklyn that has 250 teachers. Their average teacher salary went up from $87,000 to $89,000. Their FSF increase was about $500,000, but that's exactly how much they needed to stay afloat in terms of paying teachers in their school there's contractual obligations to give them raises and so forth. So they technically did not see much at all of an increase in terms of their overall school budget, so they couldn't really hire additional support staff. Is there a plan to kind of right this ship, understanding that there are certain schools that teacher salaries are below the citywide average, but I do think that making a public promise and a pledge for schools to better meet the needs of our kids, it's not about just kind of keeping their budgets afloat. If you could speak to this.
So I'll start, and then if our CFO wants to add, I'd be happy to have her add to this. So there are a number of ways that you budget for schools. In my experience, during my time in a previous district, we were the creators of the weighted student formula, which is what we've adopted in New York City. And the notion is very simply that the money follows the student, and that there are certain weights that are attached to a student based on the special needs of the student, multilingual learners, students with disabilities, etc. And then within that system, there are ways of calculating how those adjustments and those allocations are made. One way is what New York City does, which is you use the actual salaries of the employees, and then whatever just as a very simple analogy, if you have $100 and you have a very experienced staff that adds up to $85, you've only got $15 left to spend on everything else. Whereas a school that has a similar population of students, which generates that funding, and a very inexperienced staff, they may only have to spend $50, and they've got $50. That's exactly what you're talking about, Chairman Traeger. There are models where you can average the salary so that you take the composite of the entire system of all teachers, all counselors, all social workers, all paraprofessionals, and you develop a composite average so that every school then knows that the average cost per teacher is an average. You're not paying for the highly paid, you're not paying for the lowly paid, you're paying for the average. It, in general, will give more flexibility in the school budgets for schools to allocate resources. Now, it may seem like a real no-brainer. Why don't we just do that? There are downsides to that. The downside to that is that then you run the risk, if you're not paying attention, that you have certain schools that would accumulate the most experienced teachers and not necessarily have to pay for that. And we know that experience as it pertains to quality and just experienced instruction in the classroom equates to higher achievement. So it becomes more difficult for schools that have a constant churn to get the leverage that they need to really improve their academic achievement. And they're paying a higher price for their average teacher. Now, the reason I give that little lesson in school finance is because when I said that there are no sacred cows, we're exploring what would that look like to move to a different kind of average salary system. What would be the consequences, the unintended consequences, the intended consequences? How would that look in the terms of the financial picture? So we're exploring all of those particular different kinds of funding mechanisms. I would be remiss if I didn't also say we're also looking at, can you identify a set of what we would call essential positions? What would an essential position be? This would be a conversation with our community, but it could be, as an example, every school has to have a counselor at a certain ratio. Every school has to have a nurse at a certain ratio. You identify essential positions. The difficulty with that, in all transparency, is that the way the system is currently funded, and with the $1.2 billion that is still owed to the children of New York City, we can't possibly afford that right now. So again, we want to be sure what we're looking at, how we're looking at that, and I would say you should expect to see in the next few months, 12 months at least, some ideas about how that could look in our system, especially after we have a little more clarity in terms of what's happening with the state budget as well.
Right. I just want to explain very quickly for the public in greater context. Under the current budgeting structure for schools, they're required to use the average building teacher salary in terms of how much they have to pay their educators. FSF, which we've been fighting for, is a precious funding stream that they use to pay for teachers, social workers, counselors, and paraprofessionals. Under the current structure, a school that retains quality veteran educators are punished for retaining veteran educators because their cost increased, but we're not kind of keeping up with those cost increases. So there are some schools that say we have to save money by somehow maybe letting go of veteran teachers and all that experience to hire newer teachers. And look at the areas, the commonality of where this dynamic happens. In many communities that need veteran quality experienced educators for our students that need seasoned educators in the classroom. So we do need to kind of right this ship because this is a glaring instructional issue for many of our schools. So I'll be mindful of time and turn now to my colleagues to remind them that there's 3 minutes per member. First, we'll begin with Councilmember Andy Cohen.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. All right, but I have notes, so I'm all ready. I do want to say that I appreciate the good news in your testimony about graduation rates, dropout rate, college entrance. That's very exciting and good to hear. And I also did want to echo a point that the chairman made that was so important with UPK, with the rollout of UPK. When it came to my district, I had literally 0 in DOE school existing buildings seats, not one. CBOs all stepped up to fill the gap for every single UPK seat I got. Subsequently, there has been some build out of infrastructure, but not only pay parity, but a lot of these CBOs that stepped up really when there was a challenge. When you built out the capacity, you kind of kicked them to the curb, and it's really destabilized a group of school providers, UPK providers, nursery school providers that existed for some of them for a tremendously long time in my district. And I do feel like we need to do a better job. I don't know if they're going to take the bait with 3K, like they may be like, we're not going to help you. So we need to work on that. One of the things that I really struggle with too, and I think in this conversation about diversity and equity, it really galls me when someone says, oh, that's a bad school. I really visit, particularly my elementary schools and my middle schools, and I know that, on the statewide test that this school performs higher than that school, but when I go through the building, I see classrooms where it appears to me that learning is taking place, the bulletin boards are covered with art, that things are happening, and I don't know how to frame the discussion with people. That is not what do you want from this school? Things seem to me, the right things seem to be happening there, and I wonder, I just don't know how to communicate it to people. Like the chair said, a school has a significant population living in a shelter, or, I have a significant, huge immigration population from Bangladesh, from Central and South America. You know, the kids are learning to speak English, so they don't score as well on the tests, but it's not the school. I don't know how to communicate that. I don't know how you communicate that. I'd appreciate a little help on that.
Well, council member, I appreciate this. So I'm going to invite our hundreds of closest friends to our therapy session. I couldn't agree with you more. I will tell you, I visit schools every week. I've visited in my 12 months, 11 months here now, hundreds of schools. And I will tell you that my impression is that schools are doing God's work in many difficult circumstances. And in those schools, I have never met a school where the faculty and the leadership say, I think we're just going to be a bad school today. I don't think we're going to do well by kids today. What I have seen are people that are very, very committed to doing well by children. What I say in terms of historic underserving of schools is why I refer to it as historic underserving of schools and communities, because we have not invested the resources or the supports to help the school communities that are doing that work actually do that work in a much more strategic way. So what I would say to folks when I get that question on the subway, and people say, well, you know, why do you have so many bad schools? I say, tell me which school you visited that's a bad school. Well, I haven't visited a school. I've been told that this school, well, why have you been told that's a bad school? Well, look at their test scores. And I've said, well, then test scores aren't the sole determinant of a bad school or a bad anything. Have you talked to the teachers? Have you felt the environment? Have you looked at what they do? Do you look at who their students are? Have you seen what the growth is every day? Do you know what they do in the community? So one of the things I would challenge people to do, and if it's useful, I'd give this to you as well, is challenge people to visit schools that they think or have been told are bad schools. I think they will have a very different impression about what the school really is once they actually step foot in the school and experience it.
Thank you, Chancellor. If there's a round two, Chair, if you could sign me up, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Cohen. Next, we have Councilmember Rose.
Thank you. Hi, Chancellor. How are you doing? I haven't seen you on Staten Island in a little bit. But
I'm a-comin'. I need my pizza fix.
okay, okay. So I have a bunch of questions, so I'm just going to go into them. Have you talked about the possibility of baselining teacher's choice? Because we're talking about school success and making sure that schools are equipped with what they need. This is a basic necessity. And teachers shouldn't have to, and the city council, frankly, shouldn't have to provide equipment and supplies for teachers to do their job. So is there any talk about baselining teacher's choice?
We're actually engaging in that conversation. We've engaged in that conversation. And again, we think it's very beneficial for teachers, but there are ongoing conversations about that very topic with our partners at OMB and City Hall.
So is there a possibility that we'll see it in this budget?
I'm an optimist, so I think there's always a possibility. The realist side of me says without additional funding, you have to weigh that against other priorities, and then that's what becomes the difficult choices. But we think there's value to it, and that's why we're continuing to have those conversations.
Okay. I understand the importance of weighing things because I really want to see guidance counselors and social workers. However, how do you get the job done if you don't have the equipment to do it? So Title IX, does DOE currently have a Title IX coordinator on staff? And if not, what's your hiring estimation?
So Title IX,
Staff.
yes, ma'am. As a federal requirement, I am sure we have a Title IX coordinator. I don't know the exact name, but we can get that information to you right away.
So there are over 1.1 million students in DOE public schools, and yet you have one Title IX coordinator. Are you planning to increase this number so that students will be able to have a Title IX, the appropriate number of Title IX coordinators? And what do you think would be the appropriate staffing level for DOE to properly respond to Title IX concerns?
So, Councilmember Rose, I think first and foremost, Title IX, one of the fundamental responsibilities of Title IX is to ensure that all students are being served, especially as it pertains to opportunities. So I think that we should have as robust infrastructure as possible. Now, what is the appropriate way of doing that? It depends how you organize that service. I worked in a very large urban school system, nowhere as large as New York, but I did work in a large urban system where we had a system-wide director of Title IX, and then what we did is we actually trained an administrator at every campus and an administrator in every department to be the associate, if you will, Title IX person. So they were trained, they had a reporting structure, they had a responsibility matrix, and that was our way of, within a constrained budget, to be able to have that service represented at the school site and at the department level site as well. So we will get back to you on where we are now, but I will tell you that there are other ways other than just having people solely designated that I've seen be successful in making sure that we have a robust Title IX enforcement.
So do you have an idea of what the appropriate number would be to adequately address this population? And are you planning to increase?
Well, it's an equity issue for us, so absolutely we're focused on it. Let me get back to you on what the team is developing on that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Next, we have Councilmember Chin.
Thank you, Chair. Chancellor, good morning. Chancellor, we've been spending so much time on this specialized high school. I think that, of course, New York Times, when they said only 7 black students out of 895 were accepted. But what is the administration going to do in the long run? Because we have invested money in the DREAM program and trying to do more outreach and test prep to help. But what's missing is the pipeline. We don't even have gifted and talented program in every single district in our schools, right? It's not enough. And that's something that the administration should really look at. And also, how do we make sure that every single high school, as you said earlier, we have good schools, but people don't know about it and they just hearsay. I have a lot of different types of high school in my district, from the elite specialized high school to the regular school. But I support every single one of them because every kid who go to that school expect the best education. And we need to turn this conversation around. How do we make each school safe and great for our kids because they deserve that? Funding is one thing, and we need to get the resources from Albany. But we need, as a city, as a whole, we all need to help promote those schools and to make sure that they have the resources. But really setting up a pipeline and really putting honors program in high school, creating every single high school as the best there is. I think that is something that DOE need to work with us. As you said earlier, the city council, we have invested so much resources in our school. All these technology lab, even science lab. One of my first capital project was a science lab in a middle school. Why are we doing that? How come DOE is not doing that? Right? So we need to really work on that partnership, and we really want your commitment into creating more gifted and talented program throughout the district, in every single school in our district.
Thank you, Councilmember Chin. So we share your passion for making sure that all of our students have a rigorous opportunity for pursuing education, whether it's at the middle school level, when they leave our elementary schools, or our high school level. So we share that, and part of the data that I shared in my opening remarks in terms of what's the evidence in terms of how are we doing, We have continued increases in the areas we should be increasing. Academic achievement is continuing to tick upwards. Graduation rates, college going rates, attendance rates, dropout rates are coming down, suspension rates are coming down. So there are some good barometers that show, yes, we are investing in the right things at elementary, middle school, and high school. The other thing is, and I respect the voices around this conversation that is happening around opportunities to go to certain schools. I think what is important to also recognize is that a system will give you what a system is set up to give you. The system and structures will produce what it's designed to produce. And what we're talking about here is three things, if I may. Number one, the 1.1 million students in the New York City Department of Education, 70% of the students are Black and Latino, 70%. So it is absolutely abhorrent and unacceptable that students, 10 offers are made to students to go to a specialized school. That is unacceptable given who we are in New York City. And anyone who says that that is, and I'm not saying you are,
No, I'm not.
I know-
I'm saying that is unacceptable.
I heard you very loud and clear, and I want to reemphasize, you're not saying that. But there are voices out there that say, well, they should just work harder. There are voices out there that say, well, if they cared more about their education, they would be able to do it, because look at others are able to do it. There is an opportunity gap, and the system that's been set up, and I'm going to be very specific because I've been on the record about this, the specialized high school admissions test is neither valid nor reliable as the sole criteria to determine talent to go to a specialized environment. There is no evidence for that, yet we depend on that as the sole criteria to identify students that are able to go to those schools.
Now, does DOE have a say in those tests? I mean, can DOE reform those tests?
No. There is a state law that requires that specific test. And as I've done my homework as well, I would encourage everyone to do, in the audience, I know the council's done their homework. Chalkbeat had a great article about what was the initial intent in the 1970s around putting this state law in place. Who was it intended to keep from going to those schools? Read the newspaper, they'll tell you all about it. So I think there's a structural issue that as a chancellor, as an educator, I cannot be quiet about. There is a structural issue. Number two, when we talk about gifted and talented, if you ask, and this is work that we're engaging in right now, if you ask 100 people what is a gifted and talented program, you will get 200 answers of what a gifted and talented program is. And when you look at the gifted and talented program, what it basically boils down to in our current iteration as expressed in New York City is you test early, you identify them, and then it's just more and faster. It's not an enriched curriculum. It's not a significantly different curriculum. And then the fact that we test 4-year-olds for a gifted and talented program, for me, there's no basis in the research that shows that's the effective way. So we've got a lot of work to do on gifted and talented, and we're doing that work by engaging our communities as we speak, but I think it also gets put into the body politic that says if you only had more gifted and talented programs, you would have more of a pipeline. That's not true. There are incredible things that are happening in our schools that are preparing Black and Latino and other students. The opportunities aren't there because it doesn't matter how well they do in school. Even if a student is in a gifted and talented program, that really doesn't matter because they have to just take one test that's not aligned to state standards, and that's the sole determinant if they get to go to one of these schools. There's a misalignment of resources. The third thing that I would say, and I've said this publicly as well, is that there is a perception with my fellow New Yorkers that say, and it's to the council members' early comment, about there is this perception that you have to go to certain schools if you want to get a good education. People have not even looked at these schools, they've not even walked into different schools, but there is this perception that you have to go to certain elementary schools, and if you don't, forget it, don't go to the public schools. And then you have to go to certain middle schools, and if you don't get to one of those 21 middle schools that will get you to one of the specialized schools, then forget it, all is lost. And then you only can go to these specialized schools. They don't even take a look at the wonderful schools that you have in your area. So we have a conversation in New York to be had about look at your schools. Look at the incredible opportunities there are in your schools. Consider for a minute that there is more than a portfolio of 4 or 5 schools, that there are tremendous opportunities. I truly believe that if New Yorkers actually looked at the incredible panorama of educational opportunities in the schools, in their neighborhoods, they would find hidden gems that they hadn't even considered because somebody told them way back when, you don't want to go to any school except that school. So I think that there are a lot of different facets to the conversation, but what I'm really excited about is that we're having this conversation. We need to have this conversation because New York can lead in this particular respect, especially of who we are.
I think we can start with the middle school directory and the high school directory, that it should not just base on the test scores,
Yes.
that every school should be able to highlight, the positive aspect of that school. The information are not there. And parents are not going to be able to visit every school. But information about that school, the good stuff about that school, that should be in the guide. So the parents can read about it and then consider it. And right now, it's missing.
Look forward to working with anyone on that, but I think that's an excellent point.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, thank you very much. And just a quick follow-up, Mr. Chancellor. Who, I know the state mandates the exam. Who actually pays for it?
The school system, I believe, pays for it. We pay for that. It's part of the state law.
Right. And does the city have any say in terms of the contracting with, what's the name of the company that produces the exam?
What is? We'll have to get that information for you.
Right. I would appreciate that because I'm curious to know if we're paying for it and we bid out and we select the company, does the city of New York have any say in shaping the test? At minimum, as one criticism I've heard correctly, which is valid, why isn't it aligned, for example, to state curriculum? Does the city have discretion and power to make it aligned to state curriculum? And so I would appreciate follow-up on that. Thank you, Mr. Chancellor.
Sure.
Next, we have Councilmember Brennan.
Thank you, Chair. Chancellor, always good to see you. I have 2 things. First thing, I have to bring something to your attention that was in a local newspaper in my district. It's a story that warmed my heart and broke my heart at the same time. It's IS 201, and it's a story about 3 kids who, for their STEAM Expo project, they built a desk for one of their classmates who's a wheelchair user, which is great. But it kind of blew my mind because I'd assumed that, kids who are using wheelchairs were already given some sort of special desks. And the kids go on to say that there are 4 other students who use wheelchairs in their school. So for kids that use wheelchairs, are they given, and the school is ADA compliant, of course, but are they given special desks of some sort? I don't know why these kids have to build them a desk.
Yeah, so I also read that article and it similarly warmed my heart, but it did raise some questions. So we're looking into why exactly.
Okay.
We don't know if they decided to build this in lieu of what's provided to meet the needs of that student. But I will say to you that a student with a disability with an IEP where it's clearly identified what they need to be able to address the curriculum, we provide that for them.
Yeah.
So we can
And that's
come
what I
back
thought. It
with
was-
more details. on it.
Yeah, okay. And then I have to echo strongly what my colleague Andy Cohen said before. I'm hearing the same thing from CBOs in my district, and I've been working closely with Deputy Chancellor Wallach on this. These CBOs feel like they were there during the hot and heavy days of pre-K when we were, I worked for DOE. I remember we were stashing kids in garages if we had to make those numbers, because the demand was so high.
Yeah.
And it was great. Now that things have leveled out, a lot of these CBOs feel like they've been hung out to dry and they've been sold out, and then that they're being cannibalized by, that we're building more and more of these early ed centers. So something's got to give here. Look, I don't think that the DOE is responsible for keeping private businesses in business, but you've got small businesses that have been teaching generations of kids that are now, after decades, now are considering closing because they can't make ends meet because they rely on these seats and teaching these kids. I don't know what the answer is. I know, 3K, we're sort of dangling that carrot. But a lot of these groups, I don't blame them that they don't have much faith in that. So and hearing from Councilman Cohen today, who's a million miles from my district, it's clear that it's a citywide issue, and I'm hoping that you guys will take a serious look at it.
So, Councilman Brannon, again, thank you for that. As I mentioned earlier in my testimony, we absolutely are committed to working with our community-based organizations and our partners. And I will tell you that I've had the ability to visit many of those classrooms out in the community. I'm impressed by what I see and the dedication of what I see. So in the current RFP that we've put out, we've alluded to the fact, obviously within the environment of we don't have a settled budget yet, that we are committed to doing right by those organizations. I think there's also a perfect storm that the state has a responsibility in this. Specifically, there are early education agencies and businesses that provide services to students with disabilities that we work with that are funded through the state. And we've brought this to the attention of the state as well, that as they are not keeping up with the funding, those businesses are being forced to close, which overnight it results in us then having to find placements somewhere for students with disabilities almost overnight. So there's not only a local concern, but there's a state concern, and we've made that very clear to the state as well. And in addition, I know that folks have talked about the issue, Chairman Traeger talked as well about the issue of the teachers that are out in the community. I just want to be really clear that we also believe that anyone working with children should be compensated and compensated well. But it's also important for me to be very clear with the record that those teachers obviously don't work for the DOE. They have their own union. They work for their own organizations. We are involved in those conversations, in helping to move those conversations forward. But there is negotiations that are happening. And again, we know we don't negotiate in public, but and they don't negotiate with us. But we have expressed how much we are in support of the direction that you expressed. And we want them to be treated fairly.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, thank you. Chancellor, I want to be able to tell these CBOs in good faith to hang in there. I just don't want to be caught lying to them that there's nothing coming. So anything you can do, messaging to them that this is a rough patch and it'll level out when 3K comes. I think they've always worked with us in good faith. So now's not the time to change that.
I agree.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Councilmember Drum.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and good to see you, Chancellor.
Good to see you, sir.
Thank you for mentioning lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender students in your opening testimony, and for again offering to march in the Pride Parade. I look forward to hopefully joining you on that day.
It's a lot of fun.
It was a historic first that you did that, and I'm very, very proud of that.
Thank you.
And I understand also that Jared Fox held a summit where over 1,000 to maybe 1,500 students attended about a month or so ago, near the end of January, I guess it was, and that was quite successful also.
It was impressive. It was a beautiful sight to see.
It really was, yeah. Let me just talk to you a little bit about implicit bias training. Last year, the city funded implicit bias training for all DOE staff over the next 4 years. You announced that you'd be accelerating the program to take place over 2 years. So can you tell us how many staff have been trained to date, and how many staff do you expect to be trained by at the end of fiscal 19?
So, yes, sir. So for the specific numbers, I'm going to ask our Chief Financial Officer to give you those specific numbers.
Hi, thank you for the question, Councilmember Drum. We've trained several thousand teachers and other staff members this year, and we're looking to train upwards of 20,000 next year. And it's been exciting to see the work get off the ground and see the real impact that it's making in people's lives.
So when you say several thousand, can you tell us about how many thousand?
I believe, I don't want to say the incorrect number, but it's several thousand. I think it's approximately 8,000 year to date,
8,000?
with more to come for the rest of the school year, but we can provide the exact numbers.
Okay, and how are you prioritizing which staff get that training?
So what we're doing is a number of ways. First and foremost, we want to make sure that we have folks that are willing, because we want them to be the champions. As we train them, we want them to go out as well. Then we look at our data. Where do we have the greatest need based on the data? And the data is disproportionality in suspensions, disproportionality in terms of academic achievement, et cetera. And then we go out and work with those superintendents to get not only central staff, but also school-based staff as well. So we're prioritizing where we see the need based on the data that we're seeing.
Do you still expect to be able to train all staff by the end of 2020?
That's our goal, sir, and I know you asked, do we expect? It's just a matter of money. So we have the funding, we can absolutely do that, and we're continuing to advocate for that to be able to meet our goal.
And Chancellor, I think I mentioned this to you before and to your first Deputy Chancellor as well. Some teachers have told me that in that training, they're not hearing the LGBT words. Have you looked into that at all? And is that integrated into the discussions around implicit bias?
So, yeah, and I appreciate you bringing that to my attention. We've actually taken a good look at that, and we want to make sure that as we mention any particular group of people, that we want to make sure that that's not being excluded. So the good news is that that is absolutely part of the training. The not so good news was that as we started rolling out, people were kind of doing the training. There wasn't always consistency in what happened. That's been solved for now. But if I may, sir, I just also want to be sure, because implicit bias gets defined in lots of different ways. At the core of implicit bias training is what it says it is. It's about taking an inner look at who you are, what are your belief systems, and how do you act in the world based on your belief systems? And how do your belief systems manifest themselves as you interact with other individuals? So at its core, implicit bias is about self-reflection, self-identification, and then self-actualization. So that means that if I know who I am and I know what my biases are, we're going to just assume unintended, and in some cases could be intended, then I know how to call myself on it, I know how to check it, and then I know how that manifests onto others. When you think about that, you may or may not hear people talk all the time about LGBTQ, or you may not hear them talk about immigrant. You may not hear, because it's so personalized. But as we do multiple sessions, that becomes much more relevant and prevalent in those conversations, because then as you understand yourself and then how do you work with others, the others are all represented by all of the groups of people. So part of it also is how we're rolling it out and at what stage people are being trained. But you have my commitment here, sir, that as you know my personal story and my family, and this is an issue that is very dear to my heart and will continue to be part of what we do to make sure that all students and all people are being accounted for and valued in our system.
I know I'm out of time, but let me just wrap it up by saying the reason why I harp on the LGBT is because oftentimes I think that unless it's explicitly stated, people tend not to think of that or to include that, and that's why it's so important, I think, that we make that effort to make sure people know that that is part of it.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Jerome, for your leadership, continued leadership on this very important issue. Next, we'll hear from Councilmember Cornegie.
Good morning, Chancellor. How are you?
Morning, sir.
While I respect and appreciate the comments that were made around gifted and talented, I guess you knew I'd probably be bringing up gifted and talented. We've had this conversation offline 1,000 times. I just want to provide a different perspective to what you've offered before the body today. That perspective being that for contextual purposes, I think the way that the gifted and talented programs have played out are a little bit more insidious than you've led to prior to you being here. Just for context purposes, in 1989, for example, 51% of the students at Brooklyn Tech, for example, were Black and Hispanic. Ironically, that's the same time that they centralized the gifted and talented program, meaning they took it out of the minority communities and put it in a central location and changed the complexion literally of it. I think that it's worth noting that, as many people well know, there are 7 zip codes that predominate the populations for upstate prisons. Ironically, those gifted and talented programs were removed from those same 7 zip codes. I think when we talk about pipelines, there are absolute pipelines in the city to the specialized high schools. In theater schools, some of my colleagues have districts that have predominant theater schools. In my community, we had Philip Escala, we had 308, which were literally theater schools, which created a pipeline for minority communities. Those no longer exist. So I think not giving it context doesn't give it the proper respect that it needs. It's way more insidious. And I think that my question to you is, how much money has been spent on enrichment programs and or test prep? I prefer to say enrichment programs because nobody wants to teach to a test. I get that 100%. I do agree that the new model for gifted and talented programs at 3rd grade as an on-ramp are way better than trying to test a 4-year-old. That was that was based on vocabulary and was discriminatory in practice in some circles. But I want to know what we're doing now. How much money is being spent on enrichment and or test prep for minority students to get into specialized high schools?
Sure. So I'll start, and then I'll ask our Chief Financial Officer to give you specifics. So I appreciate the context. I think that's an important piece of it. When you look at the continuum of learning for all students, we often talk about students with disabilities as needing services and supports. But we rarely talk about gifted students and what do they need to be serviced in a classroom environment so that they can maximize their learning potential as well. So these are ends of a continuum that you have to look at. How do you provide services to those students? So as we're getting better and we're becoming much more grounded in the research of what is effective in brain science and how children actually learn, I agree with you. We should have those specific programs represented in all of our communities, but specifically in our historically underrepresented communities so that students and families know how to access those programs. That's our goal. But in order to do that, what we've been able to do now is to start to really take a look at, in that continuum of instruction, how are we structuring those gifted and talented programs to truly be, number one, about identifying giftedness in a student, and then how do you develop that talent? What does that curriculum look like so that you're actually enriching those students because of their particular gifted needs? With that said, we've made some investments. I'm going to ask our Chief Financial Officer to talk a little bit about that.
Thank you, Councilmember. So we have 2 programs, the Discovery Program, which is designed to increase enrollment of low-income students who are just at the threshold of the specialized high school threshold. That's about $500,000 that we invest annually in that program. In addition to that, we have the DREAM program. We invest $2.5 million in that program. That's an after-school program which is tutoring students on the specialized high school exam.
So thank you for that. I really appreciate that. I've asked from our body another $1 million to be given to nonprofits to help with that process. I'm hoping that my colleagues will agree with me and sign on to that. I just think that we have to reimagine the way this works. Listen, we made a huge stink about this under the former administration and reinstituted gifted and talented programs. So this is actually new for minority communities, where we've reinstituted those programs back in the community over the last 3 years. Unfortunately, they were reinstituted and are tremendously under-resourced. So parents still have a quandary. You should know, and I've talked to you about it, but on the record, I'd like to say that we've also created legislation that added the that added the gifted and talented offering for the exam in the universal 3K package, because access was another difficulty that parents were experiencing. So we're trying from a council perspective to do everything we can. We want to work in tandem with the DOE where we recognize that there are pathways to building capacity for minority communities to participate in this. Now I know that there's a movement to, there's all kind of conversations about taking away the test. In the interim, there are still students who could benefit from a pathway into the specialized high schools through gifted and talented programs. I think that's a pipeline that we need to revisit because it's already been reinstituted in our communities. It just needs to be resourced correctly.